Keep me on there if I can. Oh, let's see if this works. So I somehow got myself back. All right, give me a moment here. Okay, there we go. So this is the book, With Love and Affection, Your Sailor Ben, World War II Letters of B.H. Mauer. So what I did was I took his 244 letters that he wrote and compiled them into a book with photos and documents. The first set of letters were from his time when he first joined the U.S. Maritime Services in Florida from 1941 to 42. The first one here, you can see, "Dearest Mom, I'm glad that you enjoyed your wedding anniversary. I'd like to come home and see all the gifts that you described." The second one, yeah, this is gonna be a problem here. Second one, he goes, "Dear Dad, ye team, I'm aboard ship now. The only thing to temper my joy is that I couldn't get into the engine department." Do you see me at all, Sarah?
Yes.
Yes, I can see.
Okay, my face still shows up. Okay, I didn't want to lose some of my gestures and expressions. All right, so going on, the next letter is while he's there in 1941, he hears the news of the attack on Pearl Harbor. This is the letter that he wrote at that time. "Sunday afternoon, dearest Mom, received a word from you on Friday. Thanks for the pictures and send some more. A few of the large ones taken by Walter. Saturday morning, I had my first inspection aboard the Tusitala after," forgot what I was writing. "It's now about 4 hours after I started this letter. Thomason came in and said that a bulletin had come in that Pearl Harbor had been attacked. Then everything became a mess. I only half believed Thomason. It came into my mind that today was Sunday, the favorite day for a surprise attack by the Axis, Poland, Russia, etc. Rushed to the nearby radio. Bulletins were coming in. Planes over Hawaii and Manila." And a few other excerpts here. "Most of us crowded around the radios. A sizable portion played cards, but even they were serious." I love this line, captures it so well. "We felt our world collapsing about us. Some half-heartedly said they wanted to get out. Others expressed their desire to get into action by joining the Navy. After an hour of listening, I wished to get my mind off this situation. We got our football and had a swell game while the bombs came down." So, I mean, there are gems in these letters like that. This just takes your breath away. What it was like hearing the exact moment, the news, and knowing that this little maritime service that he joined was going to be something totally different. Next set of letters come after he becomes a cadet at the Merchant Marine Academy in Kings Point, Long Island. The Merchant Marine is one of the 5 federal service academies, along with West Point and all the other different federal service academies. You can see the letterhead here. "My dear brother." So he's talking to his brother, Arnie. There he is as a cadet. The next set of letters, which is the bulk of them, are after he's joined the Navy. So the Merchant Marine Cadet course was originally supposed to be a 4-year program. They condensed it down to 17 months because they needed to get officers out there. So he joins the Navy then in 43. A beautiful Navy letterhead, it's embossed like that. The audience that he was writing for consisted of 3 groups of people that kept his letters. His parents, Marie and Fred, kept every letter that he sent home. His brother Arnie, who was in the Air Force, and then Roz, Arnie's girlfriend, then fiance, then wife. So all of the 244 letters come from the saved letters of those 3 people. The letters were crucial to him and to every man in the service at that time. "Dear Mom, when I get a letter, my heart takes a very skip and then starts thumping. After you're finished reading the letter, you feel good. You're at peace with the world, you like it, and it likes you." And so what I find in the letters is a constant plea for please send letters, please write. I haven't got anything for a couple months. I know, we're going to be getting some supplies soon. Hopefully I'll get caught up. So this constant desire to be in touch. There's his parents at the top with Rosalind over on the right, and his brother Arnie getting his wings in the Air Force. And from the Navy to the Army Air Force, we have the letters flying back between the services. Wish you, Mom, and Arnie would write. Tell me about everything. The more ordinary they are, the better I'll like it. Write as though you were talking to me. Throughout the letters, there's this desire for the ordinary, the day-to-day, just wanting to keep in touch with that life that he'd left behind. Now, let me back up just a little bit and or go forward in time, however you want to look at it, and introduce you to the man that you might have met. This was his job in Findlay. He was the State District Forester. He worked in that beautiful old building that's now been torn down on Lima Avenue. You might recognize that, the Department of Natural Resources. Was very happy there. He spent at least he spent almost half of his life as a Findlay resident from 1961 to his death in 1998. So yeah, he's a boy from New York, spent his time in the Navy, but Findlay, Ohio was really his home. Here he is helping some farm foresters diagnose diseases, helping them decide when to harvest their great oaks and walnut trees, helping set up windbreaks. So that was his job while he was in Findlay. Of course, I knew him. That's my father. Here he is with my two older brothers, and then I came along. But for the purpose of today's presentation, we're going to be looking at Bernie Mauer, Benny, he went by all of those names, as a sailor. And what better way to get to know a sailor than by looking at his ships? So I'm going to take you on a quick tour of the different ships he served on. First one was the training vessel Tusitala. It was originally built in 1883. It's a sailing ship. This is where they literally learned the ropes down in St. Petersburg, Florida, as part of the maritime service. Here's the training station. A very famous ship that he also trained on while he was in St. Petersburg was a USS Joseph Conrad. Originally launched in 1882, it's now a museum ship at the Mystic Seaport Museum. So beautiful, beautiful sailing ship. But to get the more up-to-date practice, they would traverse the Gulf of Mexico from St. Petersburg to Corpus Christi, Texas, to learn how the steamers and the boilers worked. Here he is on the SS American Seaman. Another ship he briefly served on was the SS Tamaulipas. This was an oil tanker in April 1942. Here's another view of the SS Tamaulipas, and that's going to be a story I'm going to come back to in a little bit. So hold that thought of this submerged, sunken, wrecked ship. Once he joined the Merchant Marine Academy, in that 17-month training, they had to do a lot of training on sea. So the MV Thunderer was the training ship, took 2 trips to South America from June to December 1942, and learned a lot from people from all over the world. It was quite an international training session. And then finally, this is the ship he spent most of his career on, the USS Blue Ridge, the AGC-2, an Appalachian-class amphibious force flagship. He served in the South Pacific. He was part of MacArthur's Navy, the 7th Amphibious Force. His admiral was Admiral Barbie, and this particular ship was fitted out as the command ship, flagship for Admiral Barbie. Barbie had started the amphibious landings long before the Blue Ridge came along, and he was constantly having to make do with command ships that didn't quite serve the purpose. So the Blue Ridge was specially set up to have communications, radio, printing press, photographic lab. It was basically headquarters on a ship. It wasn't designed for battle. It was designed to be the headquarters. After the war was over, it was time to bring the troops back, and the USS Mount Vernon was the boat that they took to Le Havre, France, to bring back the GIs. And then again, after the war, his very last ship that he worked on was US Chandeleur. It was time to put some of these ships into mothballs to get the engines oiled and greased and everything set, so in case they were needed again for like the Korean War, they'd be ready to go into action. So those are his ships. After the war, he went on to Syracuse University, which had always been his goal, studied at the College of Forestry. Now, anytime you talk about war letters, you're expecting to read about major action. While that's not the bulk of his letters, there are two particular times that I can refer to where we get to understand and see the major action that he went through. The first time takes us back to that Tamaulipas I said I was going to come back to. And this is really how I ended up doing this presentation through Findlay, because Findlay Courier had actually done an article on this on the 50th anniversary of it happening. And my dad wrote an article that they published, a torpedo struck amidships setting off an inferno. The German submarines were off the Atlantic coast and they were having a field day with the American tankers. Some of his recollections from this article I selected here. That night, just after going to sleep, I was tossed off the cot onto the deck. The ship was no longer blacked out. A torpedo had struck the vessel amidships, setting the fuel oil on fire. They were fully loaded. Heading down the ladder to the assigned boat station, I was stopped by a wall of flames. A fine spray of oil floated in the wind. I quickly joined up with other crew members and we were not successful in launching the aft port lifeboat. Then an attempt was made to get to the aft starboard boat into the water. An able-bodied seaman took too many turns off the cleat, causing the bow to tip into the sea. It was a frightening moment. We could have lost our last lifeboat. I slid down a line and cast loose the forward falls. With the boat loaded, we were about to cast off when a cook appeared on deck. Despite pleas to come down the line, he jumped directly into the boat. A few men sustained bruises in breaking his fall. With an overloaded lifeboat, it was hard to row through the choppy seas. We had about 27 men in our boat, while the captain had about 6 men in the number 1 lifeboat. An AB without pants was steering our boat. He spotted someone floating a short distance away. Soon a badly burned seaman was hauled into the boat. Looking back from about a mile away, we could see the flames spreading aft from amidships. The blazing inferno was surely visible from the Cape Lookout, North Carolina, lighthouse. The torpedo had broken the back of the tanker, causing the bow to rise up and the propeller to come out of the water. It was a very tumultuous time. It was called the second happy time. Not happy for the United States, happy for the German submarine commanders. The second happy time, the second bullet point there, lasted from January 42 to about August of that year. During the first and second happy times, the Axis submarine sank 609 ships, totaling 3.1 million tons. This led to the loss of thousands of lives, mainly those of merchant mariners, against the loss of only 22 U-boats. And so what we have, here's an example. This isn't my dad's ship, it was at night. Here's a torpedo, a tanker being torpedoed. And so what we end up having is the graveyard of the Atlantic. It joins ships from many other centuries, but that's 609 during this time. And it now is a popular scuba diving area. People can go down and take pictures and see what's left behind from these wrecks. The German U-boat commander that sunk my dad's ship was Erich Toep. He was a very famous man. He actually ended up serving on a NATO committee. Is that right? Anyway, he was somehow involved in the government. I looked this up and I forgot it. But there he is. And my dad was intrigued to see if he could find out about him again, 50 years after the fact. And he was pleased and surprised to actually receive some correspondence back from him. He talks to Dear Mr. Mauer, and in the letter he says, I must confess that we had not much time to think about the sad loss and fatality of the ship's crew. When you've read my book, The Odyssey of a U-Boat Commander, you find that thinking and meditating on the war was left for the time after the war. He even sent his log of the events that happened on board the U-boat at the time when they torpedoed my dad's ship. So here at the very bottom, you can see at 0540, this is in German on the left, shadow in sight. I move near him on his starboard side. It's a big tanker, Tamaulipas, about 10,000 tons. Very dark night. The sea is highly phosphorized. Tanker is in position 30, about 1,000 meters abaft. Switched to electric motors and slowly turned with the tanker. To avoid failure by the questionable torpedo, I decided to fire at an angle of 180 degrees. And he was successful. That was the last torpedo on the ship. So after that point, they turned and went back home. So unfortunately, my dad's ship was unfortunate. However, this was a life-changing event, yes? No longer was I a boy living in a man's world, but an unsinkable seaman. So he was charged up. It wasn't like, oh, what did I get into myself into? It's like, oh, you know, this is the stuff that I kind of dreamed of, seeking this adventure. The other significant major action that my dad participated in was the Battle of Leyte Gulf, liberation of the Philippines. The photos at the bottom of the page there are from the war correspondents aboard his ship who came on board for this 2 weeks time. And they took over the little press news that they had for the shipment. And so my dad kept all these, and I've actually made another little book containing all of these documents as well that I'm willing to share with anybody who wants just me to send the PDFs. They're fascinating in themselves. But anyway, Daniel Barbie, as I said, was the admiral that came aboard this ship. The USS Blue Ridge is going into a combat operation for the first time. And this message, by the way, was written in the newsletters. This ship has not been used in combat before, as it was needed for other purposes. I know how disappointed you were when it was necessary in most operations to leave you behind. We go into this operation, however, as a flagship of a force whose purpose is to liberate the Philippines. This operation is the largest ever undertaken in the Pacific and can well be considered one of the most important of this war. It is reasonable to expect some form of enemy attack. It may come in the form of a surface attack or a small craft at night, and quite probably a night attack by a small group of planes. And there's always the possibility of a daylight attack. I know that every man is trained hard. I feel that the ship is ready to meet any form of attack. Just a little note, the present tense that this is written in is the magic that these letters convey. I'm not reading about history in the past tense. I'm reading about it as it unfolds, and they don't know. They might not survive this attack, even though they're not particularly a combat ship themselves. They would still be a target, a very important target. This was part of MacArthur's declaration of I shall return after he had to leave Corregidor in the Philippines and leave the remaining prisoners of war and the civilians who were interned at Santo Tomas behind. The Battle of Leyte Gulf is considered to have been the largest naval battle of World War II, and by some criteria, possibly the largest naval battle in history, with over 200,000 naval personnel involved. So Dad was one of those 200,000. On the right, you can see the pictures of the LSTs. This was a newly created kind of ship that was able to land their troops right on shore without having a dock, a pier, bay. They could just go right onto the beach. So, of course, the problem with action in war is he can't write about it the day of. This is like a week later, he's able to finally write about it. On A Day, we struck the beaches of, that was self-censored, with the largest convoy ever assembled. I had been down in the engine room all day and sure was impatient to see what was going on. when I got a chance to, there was still lots going on. The beach was being shelled, ripped to pieces. Our own planes were overhead. It was hard to believe that the Philippines lay right over there. So I writes to his sister and to his brother, narrating these events. In his letter to Roz, there were a few tight moments when the Jap fleet was on the move. However, as you must have read, they were stopped and knocked to pieces. This morning, we received a message from our highest ranking officer praising the captain, officers, and men on the way the ship was handled, which is really something. I've been down below up to 20 hours a day, so I didn't have much time to do anything else but sleep. When we hit the old spot again, I'll be able to catch up on my sleep and do some relaxing. Now, of course, what made this time even more tense, this was the first time the kamikaze planes were used in an organized, systematic strategy. His ship, in fact, was able to take down one of the bombers. And so they got to paint a little flag there on the side of the ship. He writes, enemy planes kept coming over day after day until I grew weary at my station. Our guns kept them away and even shot one down. There's a flag painted on our bridge now. Seems hard for me to believe. It's right there in front of your eyes. Occasionally I'd be up on deck when the firing started. Once it was night, traces lit up the sky, following the plane into the clouds. That's the way they fight. Sneak in out of a cloud and try to get away before you can get them. Not as famous as the Battle of Leyte Gulf is the other landing they had to make on Lingayen Gulf. This is the liberation of Manila, which allowed them to go in and free the prisoners of war and the civilian prisoners at Santo Tomas in Manila. Here we go again, set of condition 1, which is just short of general quarters. Don't know whether I should hit the sack or not. It's tough trying to get dressed in half a minute if GQ sounds. Dash down the passageway, buttoning up your clothes. I'm tired, all right. Out of the last 24 hours, I squeezed in only an hour. But when it becomes a choice of missing everything by sleeping, I don't sleep. And take my word for it, there's plenty doing. So, yes, major events is what you expect to read about in Letters from the War. But he was on a ship in the South Pacific, waiting a lot of the time. So what I end up really seeing in these letters are a number of narratives in the letters, many different story arcs to trace. If I were just reading these for what happened during the war, I'd be pretty disappointed. Instead, we have a whole realm of different things. So I'm going to take you through a few of these story arcs that I can tease out. The first one is it's really a story of immigrants. You can see there on the left when my relatives came over, my aunt Emma and Anna, my great aunt Emma and Anna came over in 1904. My grandmother Marie Yotzat in 1908. My grandfather in 1911, Frederick Mauer, and a couple of more of her brothers. On this second line, you don't have to be able to read much, but you can see that big, long middle stretch. Those are all the aunts and uncles that my dad knew, all of them immigrants that had come over. The Mauers were from Landwehr, Poland. The Yotzats were from Schmallenken, Germany, but actually they're both now part of Lithuania and they're actually only 100 miles apart, both German speakers. Here's some of the Yotzat family that were still in Germany at the time after my grandmother had emigrated over. So it's my great-great-grandfather. Here's, these are all people he talks about in the letters. That's why I say it's a story of immigrants. So here's Unky and Tante Emma. That's them again in the middle. And then Tante Meta and her husband. There's my grandparents, Fred and Marie, coming over on the Mayflower with the chaperone, Sister Anna. I always had to have the chaperone. My grandmother, Marie Mauer, looking sweet as she can be. So they were a close-knit family, parents, aunts, uncles, cousins. He's referring to them constantly throughout the letter, checking on how they're doing. The cousins, the male cousins, they were all in the war, Army, Navy, Air Force. And that really helps me understand what the true purpose of the letters were. Yes, it was to share some of the events that were happening in the war, but mostly it was to share the care and concern he had for these family members, talking about the gifts he was buying them, thanking them for the gifts that they were sending him, and the little stories that he could share just to kind of keep that close family connection. This was his home that he was writing back home to in the Bronx, New York. This is Gunther Avenue. People are always surprised when I say my dad was from the Bronx, New York. Their eyebrows raised a little bit, but the Bronx of the 20s is, or the 1920s is nothing like the Bronx of the 2020s. He said there was a large field behind where they had a ballpark, and in front were miles of forest and swamp. He basically lived out in the country. This is where the Italians and the Irish lived. Italians had lots of farms. His cousins, Ben on the bottom left in the Christmas picture, and him in the front row. And again, all those boys would also be in the war too. His brother, of course, was his major relationship, always very close to him. There they are when they graduated from Evander's Child High School in the Bronx. Arnie was just 2 years older. Just a little interesting side note, can't help but share this. Another member of the same class that my dad graduated in from Evander's Child High School in the Bronx was Carl Reiner. There's his high school picture. All right, so another story arc to trace throughout these letters is this desire for adventure versus the longing for the comfort of home. He was just working as a bank messenger. He had gone to school for a couple of years at New York University in Washington Square, and he was attracted to these posters that he saw saying, you know, young men wanted for the Merchant Marine. And so at the age of 20, he took off to join up with the Merchant Marine. That sounds great. But at the same time, there was this beautiful pull that he had from all the time he spent out on Rocky Point, Long Island. His parents had made a bungalow there, and he spent every summer going to the beach, fishing, swimming, boating. He describes it as an idyllic boyhood. Lots of great memories made there. Every summer on the beach, just like I spent every summer at Riverside Park and had an idyllic childhood myself. This yearning to be home is expressed constantly. I do love you and miss you from morning until evening. The rest of the day I sleep soundly. I've said this before, I guess I'll say it again. We'll be together and soon, I promise. But while he yearns for home, he does become quite acclimatized to the daily life on ship and on shore. Here's the Officers Club in the Philippines in 1945. He gets to make all kinds of new friends. His shipmates, he describes them, they're a fine bunch. These are the guys I like to work with. Ray, Johnny, Bart, Kessling, and about 60 other fellows. They're the chiefs too, Gil, Van, Sterry, and the rest. We'd be drinking coffee all day as we shot the breeze. As it is now, I spend too much of my time drinking coffee. We finish a job, the fellow invites me to a cup of coffee with his bunch, then the next hour the same happens with another fellow, so the day passes as if by magic. Sure, I'm lonely, but when you're with so many fellows that are too, why we keep each other such good company that we don't mind it. Here he is with his boiler room gang. That's my dad with the star I put on there. And these guys were in charge of keeping that ship running. Spent a lot of time playing cards. Fortune in the guise of bum poker hands and cards keeps me writing letters in the evenings. I lose my stake the first of the month when we get paid, and then I have every evening free to write until the next month. Ran true to form after being paid yesterday. All I can say is that I'm contributing to the support of some families of worthy citizens. Now, he didn't squander every paycheck. He sent lots of money home, bought lots of war bonds. He sought out games of pinochle instead, so he didn't have to lose his money. Part of ship life was going off ship too, and taking leaves in Australia. And he met up with a lot of father figures. I think he was constantly looking for father figures and some good home cooked meals. So he met up with a family, the Nathans in Australia, the Cayugans in Manila, Marcos in Manila, and the Chillingsworths in Hawaii. We hear about those families. Liberty and Sydney, he meets up with this family and spends a lot of time vacationing with them. There's a picture he had made while he was in Australia. Movies, though, so many mentions of movie titles, and the reason is that he was in charge of getting them. They go to shore and pick them up, and he was in charge of getting screens set up on ship. These men needed entertainment of some sort, and so they kept them busy every night with a new movie. Bogart gets into every movie we see. Another gangster picture tonight, The Big Shot. And as usual, there was H. Bogart, the tough guy. I know his map like the palm of my hand by this time. You must recall him. We've seen him many times. He becomes quite the movie critic. Too much Bogart. Seen a swell picture last night, Lassie Come Home. The story of a kid's dog who's stuck by the kid through thick and thin. It's of this collie, a beautiful long-haired dog. It was so enjoyable for me to read about these movies that were brand new at the time and how they affected the people that first saw them. And of course, you had to see Bob Hope if you were in the South Pacific. You can see that's the gang that he met up with. We were laughing a few minutes after Bob Hope put in his appearance on the stage. It became a riotous American show when the beautiful blonde Patty Thomas came out in a low-cut dancing costume. There sure was a lot of whistling, but Bob Hope led the rest. The show ended, and I, for one, had to hike over the hills back to the beach. Got back to the ship and noticed a few of the fellows looking up at the bridge. There stood Bob Hope. So after supper, we all went on deck, and he gave another impromptu show. He's as good as been said. He made Howard the fatal mistake of calling the bow, the front, the rear end of the ship as he opened up. We corrected him, and then he said, addressing himself to his host in English, "Why don't you tell me these things?" That bit tickled me more than anything I've seen in a long time. More sedentary form of entertainment, though, was reading. Lots of books listed in these letters. That's one thing I miss, a good book to read on the sofa. I'm going to see if I can find a library in town where I can take out a book. Boy, what I would give for the New York Times. I was surprised to hear him write about the baseball teams that he organized, and looked that up and found out that this was quite common. As the Navy crisscrossed the Pacific, sailors formed teams while on board and scheduled games whenever they reached dry land. Many of their fields had been recently abandoned by Japanese players. Now comes the harder part of whipping them into shape. So he was a team captain. There'll be some mighty sore arms after the first day, after a year or two's layoff. Whose arms wouldn't hurt a bit? I'm gonna skip a few of these. I'm kind of watching my clock here. It's a little overambitious with my PowerPoint. He felt like he was just a spectator. This is a common strain throughout the letters too. I find it tiresome doing nothing much. So you can see why I'd like to get a transfer. He described himself as feeling a lot like Mr. Roberts in this movie, Henry Fonda in the movie Mr. Roberts, just feeling so stuck, wanting to do more. He had joined hoping to become active and fighting the Axis, and now he's just sitting on a ship. Well, he did have quite a view, though. Coming up on top side on A day, you see a sight which hits you like a ton of bricks. A vast bay of water, ships as far as you can see through the telescope, smoke half hiding the shore made by the firing warships. Watching the warships and the distant hits on the target, we line the rail talking of whatever swings into view, of ships we recognize, of ships we've never seen before, identify planes, argue over their identity, spent the day idly in this way with my firing gang. He shared later that it was sometimes frustrating that they'd bring these troops in, land them, those guys would go off, do what they had to do, they'd come back on, they'd take them someplace else, land them. And so he felt like he was just a spectator. I won't read all of these, but throughout the letters, there's this constant love of nature for a future forester. Talks about the waves and the stars and the lakes, the wind and the mist. Throughout, we see the influence of the academy on his training in the military. I don't know yet how hard the work is going to be, but I'm prepared for anything. To learn to become an engineer will be a struggle, which would take everything I've got. So these and other lines like them really capture what they entitled the greatest generation. These were people willing to work hard, and that work ethic stayed with them through life. Writing about inspection, how they had to get everything just right for their Captain Criddle here. What I learned through this experience of putting together the book was the incredible power that a letter has. It creates an immediacy that a history book couldn't. The uncertainty is there. They don't know how things are going to end. They don't realize where this war is taking them. The honesty, he's just writing to his family, his relatives. He's not trying to be something that he isn't. He's not putting on a false front. His personality, he adopts this very kind of lighthearted, off the cuff tone because he's trying to assure them that everything is well, not to worry about them. He doesn't want to burden his family with fear. So all of this comes through. The uncertainty here, I just read that New York had an air raid alarm. It's hard to believe that planes will bomb our city. So there's talk of that. We didn't know that that could have happened. The war could have landed on American soil. And of course, just another story arc would be the progress of the war. Here's some from the end. It's all over but the shouting. Well, folks, it's hard for me to believe. It's as hard for me to believe as it is for you. Can you get used to it? I can't, not yet. When I do, I'll be wanting to get out tomorrow, and tomorrow's a long way off. After the war was over, he found himself in Oahu. That's where they sent a lot of the troops for a little R&R before going back to the States. That's him, third from the left. He was there on VJ Day in Hawaii. Describes the celebration. Again, I'm not going to take time to read those right now. And finally, he's home at last after 2 years at sea. Here he is with his older brother and his father. I'll end this presentation the same way I ended the book, with a picture of my dad from 1925. There he is in his little sailor suit, not knowing what the future would be holding for him. All right, so I will stop share, and Sarah, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Carol. That was so wonderful. I love how you outlined the different story arcs. So much information in those letters. I believe we have some time to do some questions. So if you are familiar with Zoom and you know how to use the chat function, I'd ask you to please put your questions in the chat. If you're not comfortable using the chat function, we'll try to do this in organized fashion, but if you could unmute yourself and ask a question, and then I'd ask you to mute yourself again once you're done speaking. Any questions for Carol? No, Carol, you gave us so much information. Maybe people are just taking it in. Here's a question from the chat from Barbara Myers. Do I recall that your dad was also involved in the Boy Scouts? Carol, can you hear me?
Hello, am I good?
Yes, you're good.
Okay, both my brothers were in the Boy Scouts. I know my mom was a den mother and involved in that. My dad was involved somewhat, probably not to the extent that she was. But,
Okay, next question, Carol. When did you discover all of these letters?
I had always known of their existence. I never looked at them, especially as he was getting older. Once the 50th year anniversaries, he was spending more time and wrote a couple articles himself. But after he passed away, my mom said, here, you can take these. And of course, it was just all too fresh for me to really delve into. So it wasn't until 2010, I think, that I started looking at them and started reading them. And then again, I started typing them up in 2014. And then lockdown came in March, and I thought, I've put this project off long enough. So that was the first time I'd actually read all of them. So, 100 years, he would have been 100 years old this year. So, it's quite a long time to have those existence.
Carol, how did your father meet your mother?
He graduated from Syracuse and then found a position in Kentucky as a forester. And his future father-in-law had a farm with forests on it. And he visited him and got to know my father-in-law before his father-in-law before he met my mom. But he met my mom on the farm there in Morehead, Kentucky.
Next question from Dr. Bromley. I thought the Merchant Marines were part of the Coast Guard. Why didn't he transfer to the Coast Guard? And how did Pop come to Findlay from New York?
No, the Merchant Marine and Coast Guard are two separate branches. There are 5 different naval academies, and the Coast Guard's in New Haven, the Merchant Marines in Kings Point. I'm sorry, and the other question, part of the question was what?
How did your father come to Findlay from New York?
Right. So, Syracuse, Kentucky. And after he was working in Kentucky for a while, there was a better position open in Ohio. So Ohio, first he started in Defiance, Ohio, and then he got the district forester job in Findlay in 61.
Did he stay in touch with his Navy friends after the war that you're aware of?
Yeah, especially some of the Kings Point men. He even was still visiting with them, I think, like in 1994. Jack Hacker was one of his old buddies. A lot of them drifted off. Back to the question of when did I first read these letters? I think a lot of the men from World War II came back, were happy to have won the war, to have survived, to come home, raise a family, find their way back into their civilian lives. And they just didn't talk about it that much. He really didn't talk about his war experiences until like 50 years later. It was just kind of shelved.
Another question for you, Carol. How did he go about making contact with the German U-boat commander? Any idea how long it took to make that connection?
I don't think it took terribly long. I believe he contacted a professor who had done research on him, and he bridged the gap between them. I find that one of the most fascinating stories in all of this. As I said, I was an English teacher, and one of the poems I always taught my students was the Thomas Hardy poem, The Man I Killed. Had he and I but met by some old ancient inn, we should have set us down to wet by many a nipperkin. But ranged as infantry and staring face to face, I shot at him and he at me and killed him in his place. And so the idea of, people that would have met any other time, they would have been friends, but here they're in war, so they're enemies. My dad was 100% German, right? Both his parents were immigrated from German, and here he is fighting another German. So the war is over, the war is done. It's just kind of sharing notes. They were on opposite sides. They were foes in war. And now that's over, that's done. So he looked into it.
Another question, did he belong to any veterans organizations?
A little bit. I think he was a member of the VFW. I'm not sure how many activities he participated in. He did get the newsletters of the LSTs, since his ship was the Amphibious Force Command ship, and they were in charge of the LSTs getting them landing. But I don't think too many others. And Kings Point, he kept up with the newsletters with Kings Point. But he was he was mostly our dad. And, he was very much into all the wonderful things that Findlay offered. Like I said, we were at Riverside Park all the time. At this time of year, we would have been sledding down the old reservoir, ice skating on the old reservoir. He took us to the YMCA. He was a great swimmer. The Findlay Library, the Findlay Public Library, I spent my childhood marching up those steps to the Findlay Library every day. Walks to the baseball games. So most of his life was not so much connected to the war years. He was loved his job, loved talking to the farm foresters, the farmers with forests. So not much on the war, really.
Two quick questions that I.
Although,
oh, sure, go ahead.
I was going to give you one exception. I was just telling this to my husband the other day. Every now and then things came up. Like when I was a little girl, and he had to put me to sleep, he would tell me maybe war stories. I was too little to understand them, but that's all he had to work with. So I would hear sea stories at night. And then other times, like I remember in the 70s, there was a song, a popular song, Claudia, you might remember this, Smoking in the Boys' Room. He thought it was smoking in the boiler room because he knew that was against the rules. You don't smoke in the boiler room. That's bad.
Someone had asked about the name of the book, and the name of the book is With Love and Affection, Your Sailor Ben. And we do have it available in the gift shop here at the museum. And also someone has asked if the program will be available to watch later in case someone missed it. And yes, we will try to put it up on YouTube. We have recorded it.
Yeah, I picked that title. That was one of the hard decisions. And by the way, any of you considering making a book, because I know there's tons of stories out there. That's what it is. It's just making 100 hard decisions. How do I go there? How do I lay it out? How do I organize it? Where do I put this? All that. But I picked that because I really felt this was more of these were love letters. These weren't war letters. This was love being sent home to his family. And that's actually one of the lines he used. He tried to use lots of different ones as he closed his letters. So with love and affection, that's what it was all about.
And one last question from the chat. Was he a Yankee? It says, was he a Yankee or a Dodgers fan? I wonder if you mean Mets.
Oh, the Dodgers, the Bums.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah, Brooklyn Bums. I think so. He mentions them in the letters as well. Yep. Yeah, it's hard to believe that they were the Brooklyn Dodgers. Now they're somewhere else.
Yeah, I shouldn't question Dr. Brumley's knowledge of baseball there. Any other questions from the audience? If you'd like to unmute yourself. I don't think so. And I'm not seeing any others come up through the chat either. So yes, we will try to put this up on our YouTube channel, and we'll probably have that link available through Facebook and maybe through our e-newsletter to our members. We so appreciate your time today, Carol. This was a wonderful presentation. Again, the book is available in our gift shop. It's a really nice, thick book. So I'm looking forward to reading through it, especially after hearing more through the presentation. And we hope to see many of you next month for our presentation on the first Thursday of the month with Ron Ammons. Thank you, everyone. Carol, thank you.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. I appreciate it. Ron, of course, is another member of the class of 75. Claudia.
Go 75.
Yeah.
Love you, Carol.
I love you too, Claudia. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.